so I went down there to check, and she was nowhere in sight. She was just gone.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, on day 47 since Summer Wells disappeared, we're going to do a deep dive into the Sermon on the Mount. 2 weeks after 5-year-old Summer Wells disappeared from the Rogersville area of Tennessee, her mother finally broke her silence. Interestingly, her father, who'd given several interviews at that stage, was also at Candus's side when she finally spoke to the media. In terms of true crime analysis, this is a bonanza because we were able to examine not only Candus's statements, but Don's reactions to them and vice versa. And so that's what we're going to do in this episode. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. If the comments are disabled, just head on over to Twitter, use the hashtag SummerWells, and you can add Crime Rocket to leave a comment, and that'll start several threads. Just bear in mind, I'm not the person who disables comments. That is not up to me. Now, you might say we've been here before, and this is just a rehash of what we already know, but as you're about to see, as was the case in the Chris Watts case and his sermon on the porch, the insights we got at the very beginning were quite different to the insights that we got later on. They deepened and darkened over time. We found some of them slipping through the cracks. We found more slips of the tongue than we saw right in the beginning. And so we're going to probably come across more insights as our knowledge and insight of this case strengthens. Worth playing for.
Let's get the obvious stuff out of the way.
So if we go into the matrix of this crime, and certainly of the sermon on the porch, the Candus we see on June 29th is a different Candus to the one we see at the swimming hole, talking pretty convincingly to the interview room. Candus herself seems to think so too, because you'll notice on the Find Summer Wells website, the interview room version of events is there, not the earlier version from WJHL. Why do you think that is? Candus doesn't only present better on the interview room, she's dressed better. She's wearing a nice, clean, crisp, vibrant message in the interview with Chris McDonough, and the Mom Patrol emblazoned on her chest is a catchy and positive one, which it turns out does change the hearts and minds of the audience. It's certainly a better impression all round than the slurry, blurry, dressed in blue version of Candus Blythe from 2 weeks prior. It's also interesting the circumstances surrounding the two interviews. The McDonough interview was effectively a rebuttal to what Macbeth has said on the same channel and occurred almost immediately afterwards. The Sermon on the Mount occurred one day after the TBI announced they were scaling back the search. In other words, as soon as the investigation and the search appeared to go off the boil, then Candus appeared on television. Crucially, not once during the interview did either Candus or Don appeal to the authorities not to give up, to continue searching for Summer. Instead, there was a sense of resignation that it was over and that they were actually ready to give up hope. In spite of their possible readiness to abandon hope, in other words, accept their daughter isn't coming back and perhaps isn't alive, there's a deplorable lack of affect. There's no visible or obvious grief from either parent during the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, I think it's fair to say Candus doesn't shed one tear, and that Candus hasn't shed one tear, or has she? It feels as if the lack of emotion or nonchalance is inappropriate, but then we weren't sure what the baseline for these individuals were when Candus broke her silence. Well, we've seen and heard more from both of them now. So does that assessment still hold? And if it does it hold more or less in hindsight? Besides that, as we're about to see, there's also an acknowledgement, as there is in the Ramsey ransom note, as well as Kate McCann's so-called turning point dream, that Summer's no longer alive from the Wells parents. So we're going to test that assertion in this episode. So the second point to make of the 7 that I'm going to raise here, the second is the most important part of the Sermon on the Mount isn't in the Sermon on the Mount, right? The full interview posted on WJHL is 12 minutes, 23 seconds. But missing from that 12 minutes, 23 seconds extended segment is arguably the most important clip of the entire interview. It's where Candus says,
I really can't tell you all the time details because time gets away from you when you're trying to enjoy yourself.
So just to reiterate, what she says is, I really can't tell you all the time details because, and then she does like an eye roll. She says this with emphasis. Time gets away from you when you're trying to enjoy yourself, right? And I'll put a link to that original clip in the description. You're going to have to scroll down to get to it, but let's have a look. It's the second last clip from the last one. It's arguably the third last. I'm kind of getting a signal saying one of the clips possibly isn't visible, but it's the one titled Bly Speaks Out Monday Night. Now, I think it's possible and even probable that there's a lot of truth mixed into this. Probably Candus did lose track of time on June 15th. Probably she was trying to enjoy herself. What may have made that difficult? What may have made that trying to enjoy herself difficult? And what sort of measures might she have taken to make sure she did enjoy herself that day at the swimming hole? What do you think the possibilities are? And then that brings us to the third aspect I want to highlight here, which is where she says the words lured away, right? I'm a writer, an author. I've written quite a few books, and so my ears certainly prick up when I see certain kinds of locution, certain semantics, certain words that are to some extent unusual. They may not be, they may be part of that person's lexicon, but you sort of tend to have a bit of an intuitive sense about this, and you sort of wonder, would this person normally use these sort of not necessarily average terms in these circumstances? And there's certain arguments for and against it, as I said, to some extent intuitive. But at about 12 seconds into the original extended interview, Candus shares her suspicions. She feels in her heart that someone came up here and lured her away. Now, when Candus says these words, her eyebrows float upwards to emphasize the point. And I'll also put a link in the extended interview. It's right at the beginning, the first 12 seconds. Look out for when she says lured her away, and look at what happens to her eyebrows. I'm going to play you the audio just so that you can get that from the interview. And once again, this is from WJHL.
I feel in my heart that somebody has came up here and took her, has lured her away from here.
So is that word, are those terms lured away, are they accurate? And perhaps they are. Perhaps Summer was lured away, but at the swimming hole. And not lured away by a person, perhaps she was lured away by curiosity, perhaps by her own pursuit of wanting to have fun, while her mom and Macbeth were trying to do the same thing. And that brings us to point number 4. It's the word watching, and it's the number of times this word is repeated, as well as the portent of this word, as well as the thing that this word references. So at only 39 seconds into the extended version, Candus provides the verb that, as I say, is critical to the story. Can someone disappear while you're watching them? Can someone vanish, poof, right in front of you? So the only way for that to happen is, yes, when they're not being watched. So what are the boys doing in Candus's version of events when this happens? In terms of what she says during the Sermon on the Mount, what are the boys doing? Well, they're watching TV, right? That's what they're doing. That's where their attention is, all of the boys. So the next thing, they're asked to watch Summer, only they're watching something else, aren't they? It's sort of doing something without actually doing it. So in other words, to watch Summer while they're actually watching TV, they are sort of doing something. They're sort of watching Summer, but without actually doing that. Does that make sense? But the important thing is Candus sort of lets herself off the hook. She hands Summer over in her story to the boys, but the loophole is that, well, they're actually not watching her anyway. And so that can account for how she disappears, because someone isn't actually watching her. And you can understand the boys not actually watching her. I think we should also point out that Summer disappeared when the boys, plural, were supposed to be watching her. So is it their fault? Candus gives them pertinent instructions to watch Summer. And this reference is the third time she mentions the word watch over the course of about 8 seconds. I'm going to play you the clip, and I want you just to take note of how often the word watch is mentioned in this very short period of time. Okay, let's listen in.
And I watched her walk into the kitchen where the boys were watching TV. And I told the boys, I said, watch Summer, I'll be back.
Okay, number 5, she says, I went down there to check and she was just gone. Now, if this is true, it could also be a reference to the swimming hole rather than the basement. Think about those words. I went down there to check and she was just gone. Could this be a reference to the swimming hole? Because even if you're a short distance from the water's edge, you do have to go down there to check. And because the trees and foliage create a sort of visual barrier, it's only when you're down there with a clear, unfettered view of the water that you may realize she's not visible anywhere, right? Now, gone in this sense may mean not visible, or it may mean even if she is visible, she's gone. Perhaps once she's recovered from somewhere, perhaps in the water, and brought to shore, it's clear that she's gone. Once again, there's a lot of emphasis here. The emphasis, well, is the emphasis because Candus really didn't know where Summer was, or because she did know? Because she did know in that moment what had happened to her. Is that right? I mean, did she know in that moment what had happened to her? So I want you to listen to that statement from that perspective of perhaps going down to the edge of the water at the swimming hole and looking for someone, not seeing her, and then perhaps Macbeth retrieving her from the water, and then it being quite a shock what had actually happened to her.
And so I went down there to check, and she was nowhere in sight. She was just gone.
Number 6, it seems kind of elusive. And so for the first time, we hear from Don at this point. And when he does talk for the first time, it's about the red truck. And again, he seems to me to use an unusual word, I think, for him. Elusive. Is that the kind of lexicon we'd expect from Don? And then 1 month later, oddly enough, the red Toyota Tacoma has remained elusive, hasn't it?
Just go to the FBI, the police, and clear it up. I mean, I don't know, it seems kind of elusive.
And then the 7th and final point I want to bring up here is where Candus says, at least come forward and say what you've seen. Now, that is at just less than 2 minutes into the extended version. She kind of behoves the driver of the red truck to come forward and, in her words, explain themselves, right? She emphasizes with wide eyes, at least come forward and say what you've seen. But has Candus, I mean, she's had to be polygraphed 3 times. The first time, I think, they sort of sent her home because she was too tired or something. And when she's asked about huge holes in the timeline, she can't even fill in a few gaps. It's not as though, it's like, okay, I can't tell you exactly what happened for a full, let's say, 4 hours. Well, how about little pieces of it? How about 10 minutes here, 5 minutes there, another, but instead it's sort of vast swathes that she actually seems reluctant to provide any details about. Instead, she provides a reason why she can't or won't be providing more detail about the gaps in the timeline. And I actually believe her. I think she can't say what was really happening and be more specific about things like how long they were at the swimming hole, because to do so could get her into trouble.
And if you're not a suspect, at least come forward and say what you've seen.
So as I said, I've only highlighted that just for the irony, because this interview in the Sermon on the Mount has only come out 2 weeks after Summer's disappearance. And so, if she's saying, at least come forward and say what you've seen, well, has Candus? Or has Candus been somewhat reluctant? So anyway, that is 7 observations. I think that's enough. I will be continuing this deep dive in a part 2. Bear in mind, we've only examined the first 2 minutes of over 12 minutes. So there's a lot more to navigate through. So in terms of this episode, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.